I hope you enjoy your weekend, which, well, for someone starts some vacation or period already started. For me, for example, yesterday was already yeah, the day off, let's say. Yeah, looking forward to the end of the year, to the Christmas and the New Year itself. And we have a special guest today. Good morning, Valentin.
Hi, Alex. Nice to be here. Thanks for the invitation. And hi to everybody. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's already Christmas coming here.
Yeah, right. Nice to have you too. Yeah, and we have today a very well outstanding, I think, topic. Well, it's front-end related. We had, if I remember correctly, around 4 front-end topics before. So this is gonna be our fifth. I don't know if you saw previous ones. So we had one system design for front-enders, and we also had GS Code Shift. And maybe it was just interview one for front enders. Yeah, something like that. Yeah. So today is something different. Yeah. First of all, maybe it makes sense to introduce yourself, Valentin.
Yeah, totally. So yeah, my name is Valentin, and right now I live and work in Finland, and I work at a company which everybody knows, I guess. It's a Unity or Unity 3D. But the funniest part is that I'm not working on any 3D related stuff. So the whole office here in Helsinki, we work for the advertising platform. So we are dealing with a huge React development platform. That's pretty interesting and sometimes pretty challenging. And this talk is somewhat inspired a little bit of what we did with a huge React dashboard. Of course, it's not exactly what we had there, but some of the things are heavily inspired by that. And just a little bit about me, Alex. Yeah, you mentioned that it's just a fifth talk about the front-end stuff. So usually I introduce myself as a full-stack developer, but now I understand, yeah, it's a lot of front-end stuff going on with myself. Yeah. Uh, while I was preparing to this talk, I remembered that I did a client-side state management meetup about 4 years ago in Belarus with about the MobX technology and comparison of Redux and MobX stuff. And some stuff from that talk still reminds me about a lot of front-end work going on even here. So, yeah, but everything in TypeScript forever.
Yeah, I like TypeScript. What's the best about TypeScript for you?
Types and types checks. Of course, it's not the ideal solution because when you transpile it to the JavaScript, all the types, everything is vanished. So if you wanted to have the something more strict, something super, you need to think about it a little bit forward. To use some kind of runtime checks or some kind of decorators to wrap your functions with runtime checks. But you can reduce huge amount of errors just having the TypeScript as a just by using of interfaces and not using any. It is so important thing, and I hope that everybody would really.
I really like
soon understand
your
that.
attitude to TypeScript. So, what's the worst thing about TypeScript?
Any any keyboard that it is still allowed, but I understand this kind of agreement to have it. Otherwise, nobody from the pure JavaScript world would ever agree to use that. It's some kind of the how to say the agreeable evil.
Nice, cool warm up. I think. Yeah. So, what's about this talk today?
Yeah, this is a talk about the library called React Query Hooks. It is very interesting that I still wonder why it's not a part of React out of the box. And it is kind of separate library implemented to support the server state management for the React applications, but also it can be used in the other places as well, because it has capabilities for that. And we will cover some topics like why. Give me a second, I will just put the next slides maybe, and we will cover topics like what is it and what we are trying to solve with that stuff, like getting data, for example, and how we can integrate this thing into component. But more important, before that, we'll talk a little bit about why it's all needed, and so on and so forth. So we'll proceed with that. So let's start.
Nice. Yeah. Sounds cool.
Okay. So what we'll cover today, I already said a couple of words about that. We'll start from the concept sync and discuss the basic use case while we might need to use that sync. It will be mostly about getting data, but also about the data mutation and the change of the data on the client side. Of course, we will talk about how to integrate this hook into the components, how to use it, how to make it when you need several different data which are dependent on each other in the component. Talk about data change and caching capabilities. And of course, we'll have some samples and the demo of the small working application. And after the talk, you will be able, if you want, and if you have some time, you will be able to take a look to the repository with all the samples implemented. So let's start. Just the basic use case. We assume that we all work with some kinds of client-side code like UI. Even if the backend is a bigger part, sometimes we still need something to show the data, to show the result of some background calculations, for example, or to manage some data. So that's why in most cases, in 99% of cases, the developers in web development needs some kind of mechanism to load the data from the server to the web application. Maybe do some kind of transformation, like change the structure of object to make it looking more easily to use on the front-end side, show it. And of course, we anticipate that it's not immediate operation to load data over HTTP. So we need to track the loading progress to handle errors. And after that, to update UI, show the data, and maybe even handle the data change. And this talk was created because usually when people, especially when they're using React libraries, they try to solve this with a kind of very complicated mechanism, like Redux, for example. And Redux is awesome thing, but it is a full client-side state management thing. So you can do a ton of different stuff. But usually, even to solve the simple thing, the simple problem which I just described, you need to define the state, like to form the shape of that state, define the constants and small functions for the actions, how the state would be changed, implement those, implement reducers. Reducer is a Redux reaction on the state's change. So what we need to do with the state so that it gets changed. Of course, we need to cover all that with tests, and we need to implement the components reaction on the state's change. So it can be done with use selector or use reducer or whatever else with Redux. And we need to repeat it basically for every piece of the state, for every component. So if we are talking about a simple thing, when we just need to load the data, track the loading progress, show the error, show the data, it sounds kind of a lot of code and quite a bigger boilerplate for quite a simple thing. So that's why there is a React Query Hooks coming on the stage. And maybe I will do just a little small step back, because Redux and React Query Hooks are not the only libraries for such thing. Of course, there is a famous and very interesting MobX library, and I bet a lot of others. But again, most of them are trying to solve the whole problem of the client state management. And today we try to talk about a little bit simpler case. Yeah. So React Query Hooks does exactly what what we described. So it handles all the stuff, tracking progress, tracking errors, and all that stuff. But it should not be considered as a full replacement for the state management. And we'll take a look why. But now let's get straight to some kind of examples. Yeah. The simple thing, we need to get some data. And of course, in most of cases, we will load the data over HTTP. So we need to use some kind of Axios or fetch or whatever to perform the GET request. Yeah. And here in the upper sample of the code, I implemented the small get all function, which of course returned promise and written in the Typescript. And sorry for any, but the sample. which just calls axios.get with some kind of root, so how to get the data. And the sample at the bottom is the actual implementation of the usage of the React query hook. So basically, we define own hook, but in fact, it's just call the React query hook called useQuery with two parameters. The first one, how we identify the cache key for this thing, because it's going to be cached. We anticipate that we might render components again and again, and we don't want to load the data again and again unless it specifies it differently. And the second argument here is just the query function. So in the most simple world, and if you take a look just at the documentation, you will see the exact axios.get call here in the last line of the second sample. But of course, we try to bring some kind of structure to our code. So here's our hook use server data. What's next? So far, it looks pretty simple. The next, we can just define it inside a component. So imagine we have some kind of React component. I named it Hooket Component. And we can just play this line of code, which is highlighted here as number 2, use server data. The hook itself would return the big object, which has lots of things, which we'll take a look a bit later. The most essential for the current example is, of course, it returns the data. But also, it would return the flags like is loading or is success. And there will be the flag is error, for example. And we can base our component layout code on those things. So for example, we can have the is loading circle indicator. And we can show or not show it depending on the value of that is loading. And then, based on the value is success, we can actually show the data and work with the data. Until that, it might be undefined, or it might have some default value if we define that. But basically, when the hook returned is success, we can start working with the data and can start showing it in UI. And that's practically it. So we don't need to implement the reducers, the actions, whatever. We don't need to take care about anything, basically. So we can just define our derivation of the hook, use it in component, and that's it. Of course, I'm lying just a little bit right now, because we have the caching mechanism and all that stuff. So we need some kind of entry point, right? And we need to define the query client, at least somewhere once in the application. And usually it is done once, only once, even for the bigger applications, even if that's like 100 of pages. But if you want to have the more structural organization of your code, a modular thing, you can define different query clients for different models. So basically, it's just a new query client saved in some variable. And then all the components which should react on the getting of this data, on the usage of the hook, should be wrapped with the query client provider element. And all that inside would be rendered. Yeah.
May I interrupt you for a second?
Of course.
Maybe if you scroll back to a few slides, I was having a question. Yeah, here, thanks. So use query, second code, line 4. Is that one basically catching fields, entity cache and ID from the data from a server? Is that the first argument?
No, the first argument is a cache key, which is implemented as array of strings right now.
Cache key, okay.
So yeah, it's a key how the data would be cached. And it usually has such kind of structure so that you can organize your cache based on the features and based on the entity names, for example. But it can
so
be
it's
just
a constants
one single
defined
string.
by application.
Yes, kind of. And I used here just a string ID. But for example, if you will have use server data by ID and have ID as an argument, you can use it as a key part here. For example, I can just edit it like this. Yeah, so for example, we want to use ID like number here. Yeah, entity, for example, yeah. And we want to load not the list, but the just one entity, yeah? And we can use this ID as a part of the key here.
I see.
For example. And of course, we need to pass it to the function, yeah?
Yeah, thanks. Makes sense. Okay. One Hollywood question maybe. What do you
Okay,
prefer, Axios or Fetch?
Oh, I
what
don't
is your
have
recommendation?
I don't have exact preferences here, because every project has own thing and has own set of like architecture, people boards with own list of requirements for that stuff. But the output is usually very similar. Both Fetch and Axios gives you similar array of capabilities. So I don't have any exact preferences. Maybe Axios for me kind of used a little bit more frequently, according to my experience in projects I participated. And it definitely has the exceptions mechanism. Like if there is an error on the HTTP level, like you get in 500, you will receive the thrown of error when you call in that. And it is very useful. Yeah, so basically it works super well with the React Query hooks as well, because they are looking for exceptions. And I'm not totally sure how Fetch does that, so I might be mistaken. But if you don't want to bring another dependency, Fetch is your choice.
Yeah, makes sense. Thanks. And if we go to the last one, I had just last question at this point. When we configure it inside the app, one more slide, I think. Yeah, this one. So I think you have usually in configuration application file, you have more structure like that, right? You can define store there. You can define, I don't know, some maybe material UI configuration. How it's usually done? Is it one application configuration file, or you usually split it into many configuration files? What's best practice?
My preference here is to have logical splitting of all the configuration stuff. So you can have, for example, the folder with the app configuration and have several files there depending on the logical thing, like UI configuration, cache configuration, QueryClient thing, and so on and so forth. With this case, for example, and we'll take a look on the real sample a little bit later. You usually need to have, if you use Axios, you need to configure Axios, like the base or URL part, the authentication part. So it deserves to be placed in the separate file. But as well as the QueryClient is a kind of simple thing, it's also related to the caching and getting data. It could be also there, for example. It's kind of logical to me, at least. But yeah, and treated this part as example. So we need to have it like together. In the real life application, you will put this QueryClient in the separate file, and because you will need to export it from this place to other places, you will need to interact with it sometimes. Not in basic cases, but sometimes.
All right.
Thanks
Thank
for
you.
the questions, actually. That really makes sense. Okay, let's proceed a bit further. So we define the hook, which gets the data as by calling the use query React hook. And we define the QueryClient provider. So we have our application set up to load the data and to do all the needed things. I think we proceed with the presentation. We'll talk about a couple of more things, and then we'll switch to the demo and open WebStorm and see a little bit more into the code structure. Yeah, but let's just think a little bit deeper. Yeah, so we define the basic thing. What other capabilities we have? This slide shows the portion, maybe half of the response, which hook can return. If you go to the documentation, and the link would be somewhere in the slides as well, you will see more. But I guess the most essential thing is here. And we can just highlight again the data. And you see it could be undefined, but it could be the type which you used as a generics in the Typescript. This is very useful. So when you call the hook, it is very important if you use a Typescript to use the generics, those brackets, and to put exact expected types error. It would simplify your life at all. Is error just a Boolean flag? And a couple of other flags like is loading and so on, they all are based on the state property or the status property, which is also returned like a status here, the last one. And it's just a nice syntax wrappers around that. But you can just use status, and it has one of the options defined also in the sample. Very interesting and very useful thing is refetch. Refetch is actually the function. So the hook returns you a reference to a function which you can call anytime when you understand that you need to update the data. So for example, you did something, or client just need to have some kind of capability to click the button and they see that data is loaded, freshly loaded once again. So you can use the refetch. Refetch would just trigger the whole hook execution sequence once again. And all the steps would happen once again, and the UI component would be rendered once again, so on and so forth. And a couple of other things like, and a refetch is a promise, but you can ignore this part, so you can just call it because the whole thing would happen just by design. You will just expect that component would be rendered once again. And of course, there is a one more thing called remove. It is used to just clear the cache if needed. This is what hook returns. But of course, we can configure how the hook is used. And as a separate optional argument, we can put this kind of object structure into the hook and configure it to behave differently. And for example, the first and probably the most important, the most usable feature here is flag enabled. By setting this flag, you can define whether hook is working or not working. For example, and this is a very frequent use case. If you know the React hooks in general, they cannot be put inside some kind of if condition because it's just by design of React. By design of React component, if you put some hook, React expects that it would be executed every time during the render. Or if something changed inside the hook, like state of the hook was changed, it would trigger the component render once again. So if you waiting in the component for some ID, for some data to be argument of the hook, you cannot put the hook itself in the if condition. React would just not work with that. That's why React Query Hook library has enabled field. So you can make this condition by setting the correct value to enabled field. And there is a sample in the bottom of the slide, like enabled has something equal to true, or anything, basically, any kind of logical condition. This is very useful. It's lots of capabilities if you need to load several portions of different dependent data. And you can load one data, and all the other hooks would be disabled until the first hook completed successfully loading the data. One more interesting thing is keep previous data flag. By default, the previous data would be erased because we don't need to clutter the cache. Previous data for the same cache key, or not for the same, even for the different cache key if we have the ID as a part of that cache key argument. But in a lot of cases, we might want to have the paging data, like load the page number 1, load the page number 2. In order to have fast capability to switch between those pages, to keep all of those in cache, we need to set up the keep previous data to true. Also, I'm a little bit jumping between these properties, but you definitely see there is a stale time. It is caching time, basically. By default, it is kind of infinite, if I'm not mistaken, but you can set up it to wherever milliseconds you want. It could be a couple of milliseconds or seconds, or 30 minutes, for example, depending on the logical nature of your data. And more interestingly, by setting up this stale time or refetch interval, you can make the hook fetching the data proactively. For For example, if you're working with a financial app and you need to fetch the data every half of a second, you can set up refetch interval as 500 milliseconds, and it would update your React component kind of fast, and you don't need to work with that. You will just enjoy the result. Of course, the hook can take additional handlers, like what to do on success. For example, you want to have some kind of the small pop-up banner, like the data was loaded successfully. Or you don't want that, but you just want to change something. You can implement it on success. And of course, on error, you will have that capability to log the error, to send the error to Sentry, for example, to any external source, so on and so forth. And a couple of more things. You can do a transformation. There is a select function, which by default is just that does nothing. By default, it just returns the data which was received from the API, but you can implement any kind of transformations if you want. The trick is this function would be called every time. So even if the HTTP call was cached, so the next render it won't be called, but select function would be called. And this is a thing to know, because if you don't want to have it called every time, and you, for example, does some kind of heavy CPU transformations there, you really want to wrap this function with React use memo or React use callback. This is a very important thing. And the last item is the placeholder data. For example, if you do not want to have the data as undefined, but you have some kind of placeholder thing, you can just put it there, and even don't worry about this loading, for example. Very useful. Okay, let's take a little bit closer look about one thing which I just talked about, select function. Usually, API could return a lot of stuff, and we might not need to have in UI all of them. We might need just to have a couple of fields. And for example, in this sample, we just basically get a couple of fields from the received item and put it into the desired item to use in the UI. And by the way, for the writing samples for this presentation, I found the open and free to use API, which returns the list of Game of Thrones characters and houses and stuff like that. So it's all based on that. It is how it looks. And I already put React use callback here, just because I do not want to have this data.map running all over again and again and again. So I want to cache this function. And if I wanted to cache the result of this function, I would use memo with the correct dependencies, for example. And you already can see the stale time definition here as well. So it's all optional, but using that gives a lot of capabilities. Alex, do you have any questions, by the way?
Still processing it. No, I think I don't have any questions at this point. It looks like it's a very configurable query mechanism on a client side. It's integrated in React, so you don't have any additional library for that. So feels a useful tool, definitely.
That's true. Yeah, it's highly configurable, and basically, if you bring any dependencies, it's just your choice. It's not a necessity to do that. Mm-hmm. Okay, let's proceed. I just mentioned there is a use case when you have the dependent data. And if you're using the React query hooks, you first have the one hook in the component to get one kind of data. For example, like here in the top part, we are loading the Game of Thrones houses, the list of houses. And then, for example, we want to load the characters just for one house. So we need to have at least one of those. And we have the second hook. And to enable second one, waiting for the first one to be loaded, we use enabled flag as additional optional properties for the second hook. Looks like that. And in the sample, we will see that this one won't be triggered and the second one won't work until the enabled is true. So it would just return the empty undefined data and all the flags as false until it is enabled. And only after that, the process of loading here would be triggered and the component would be rendered again, but not because the first hook data more because of second hook data received. This is the field I was talking about. I really feel like we need to take a look to the real data sample. So maybe it's time to do that. Otherwise, I feel like it's a lot for the beginning, and maybe we should really take a look to the real code and then proceed with the rest of the slides. Yeah, what do you think?
Yeah, sounds good.
Okay, and let me just open my web store. Good.
If you
Great.
can make it a little bit bigger, that would help.
Yeah, I would try. Okay.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah,
I
it's
will need
already
to
much
have
better.
cool. I will need to have the console here and little bit thing here for the structure of the files and the code. So what we have. As a sample for the slides, I implemented a really simple React application, and there is a README with basically most of the things which we're talking about, and some links. So if you want, you can take a look later. What it has. Let's start from the structure. Yeah. So it has the application component. It is here, and it has the both our Hooket component and the index component, which basically is the core part of that React application. We'll take a look at that. And we have another folder called query, which handles all the stuff related to data. So for example, it has the API file with Axios configuration, right? It's what we just talked about before that. So it has the base URL for Axios and just returns the Axios instance to be used everywhere. It has some utilities. It's not super interesting. What's interesting? It has the definition for the query client. So there is only one place in our sample where query client is created and exported, so we can reuse it in other places. And it has the feature folder. We are working with a Game of Thrones features. And it has, for example, interfaces with some base entity and a couple of entity definitions which we are going to use on the client side, on UI. The real API returns a lot more features, a lot more fields. Most of those which are empty, so we don't need to use those. We just need a couple of them. And let's take a look. So I split it, every entity to two files. First file would be the API. So it would have that get function with maybe some parameters, like here we have the paging parameters. I put some kind of console logs here so that we can track in the browser console what is going on. And there is a access function to get the data, to pass the parameters which we have, and return it. Nothing special happens here unless we have those console logs. And then the query. There is some splitting again here because I moved the definition of the cache key into the separate function. It can handle some IDs if needed. Yeah, for example, we can have the optional ID, which is like a number, and we can use it here as well, something like that. But having it as a separate function is pretty useful because you can use it outside of the hook, which won't be, and it would be very repeatable. So for example, if I would just define it here like this, the query, like it was in the sample in the presentation, if I want to modify the cache by that key, I would need to repeat this sequence somewhere else. So I don't want that. I want just to have that in one place. So I do not mess up with that. Okay. So what hook does, as we did, as we've seen pretty recently. So it defines the key, how to cache that. It calls the data, and then it has the select, which just does some simple transformation. So it defined the ID by the index because I don't have real ID, and just transform some kind of names. Nothing super special. And the second part for another entity is slightly different because it has one more patch endpoint. We'll try to modify that. Yeah, it looks the same, but instead of get, it calls patch and has some kind of URL modification and payload. also console logs. And the query part as well, it has another thing to modify the data, which we'll skip at the moment, and we'll take a look a bit later. Here we have pretty the same structure. So the stale time, select function with React use callback, and so on and so forth. Now we come to the application part. And we have the Hooket component. Hooket, it means I use that name just to show that there are some hooks inside. That's it. So when component just starts to execute, component is a function here in React, we call the Usehouses hook with some parameters, and it returns the data which we will use later. Like what is the houses data? Is it loading? Is it successfully loaded? And so on. And then immediately I need to call the use characters, but I want to do it only after the first hook is completed. So I put enabled the same value which is in houses is success, so that this hook would wait for this one. We'll skip that part for a moment and get back to that a little bit later. But there we have some kind of super basic UI with the flags like it was loaded successfully, is it still loading, the data mapping, and the same for the characters. And the corner part of that, the QueryClient provider and the Hooket component. So that's pretty. Let's run. Let's start. And okay. I will reload the whole thing once again, and let's just observe what happens in the console, okay?
Mm-hmm.
So I will do the reload, and let's see. Every console log here, starting from word render, this is what happens in the UI component, the React component. So first couple of lines, we see that houses are loading, characters are not loading. And then we see a couple of other console logs that the hook started to work. So we basically call the HTTP get function. And here this call is completed. I'm not sure how it's visible, but hopefully. Then we see that characters are started to loading to be true, houses are false because they are already completed. And the same happens for the API stuff. And finally, we have all those flags are false and the data is here. It's working.
I have a few dummy questions if we can get. If we go back to the code for a second, I really like to start diving into project by looking at the package JSON. Can you open it for a second, please?
Of course.
Yeah, because I did a mistake. I actually said last time that it's in the box from the box of React functionality, but it's actually a separate dependency. Yeah.
No, it feels like out of the box React, but it is a separate library.
And is it like a core team supported library, or it's community based?
It's mostly community based. Their documentation are hosted in TanStack website, so probably there is kind of sponsor from that, but it's mostly community based as far as I understood. But we can check later.
Yeah, and I think, correct me if I'm wrong, this is created by Create React App, this whole project?
Yes.
Yeah,
I just use it. So it's pretty
nice.
Nothing super special. Yeah, I
didn't
want to lots of stuff.
Yeah. Last one I had, it's for me, it's more complicated maybe. So if you go to app tier 6 that you showed before, and scroll up a bit, like to the beginning of this component, a little bit, this one. So you pass in a flag to a second query, to a second query definition. I understood that. Yes. My question is, if I understand correctly how it's working, this whole function, component function, will be executed like I don't know what, depending on the life cycle, and basically it will it will be checking this Boolean Boolean parameter or Boolean argument every time.
Yeah. So basically, the React component, every React component is a function, and every render cycle is just a calling of this function, which would call eventually one by one every functions inside until all of those are executed successfully and return something. So when the rendering started, the code comes here, calls this function, and we immediately have something. So the loading process would be started, but we immediately will have the undefined here and true here and false here, and our execution would go to the next line. So and this is at the end of the day, it's a JavaScript. So some macro tasks would be created. They would run in kind of parallel. So we know how this function. But we will think, to simplify things, that our execution will proceed here. And when the execution process would come inside this function and inside the use query, which is hidden by this hook, it will just simply check, okay, enabled is false, and just immediately returns the default values. And that's it. And the real execution would be triggered only when this enabled would be true or undefined. So by default, it's true.
Yeah, thanks.
And I'm not 100% sure, but I think I tried to look to their code, but of course it's like if you're not inside the core team of such some quite comprehensive library, it might be hard to understand. But they are using inside the same things which are used in React. So they're heavily dependent on the React library. So they're using the use callbacks, use memo. I'm pretty sure they are using the use state. And most probably they will just have the use state to store the data and this kind of stuff. And maybe not this data, maybe to store the status flag, like what is going on right now. And when they receive the data, the state would be updated, and the hook by its nature would trigger the hosting component to render once again. And the latest render would do the same cycle here, but the hook would see, okay, I already have the data. So I will return that XT success true, is loading false, and the data, here is object for that. So to me, it's kind of looking straightforward. And it really looks in the style of React components and the modern React with the hooks. So yeah, I'm not sure if you are more like a backend developer, you must probably miss that. But it were times when React used the classes as components, and there were a lot, the huge community supporting that. And when they started to just convert components to functions, people started to hate that for the first time because they needed to understand, okay, what's happening. But then gradually React migrated to the state when every component is a function. And if you want to have some kind of life cycle intervention, you will use hooks inside, which are also functions. And the only difference is that if something changes inside a hook, the hosting function, which are components, will be called once again, and the rendering would happen once again. So from the developer's perspective, it's very straightforward. It's just a set of functions dependent a little bit on each other. Okay, maybe we will proceed to the second part of the slides, because we have a couple of interesting examples there, and then get back to the code to take a look to how we can work with the QueryClient. Okay.
Sounds great.
But I forget where my presentation is. So excuse me for a second, and I will try to, okay. Oh, and by the way, while I was opening it, so there is a 10stack.com website with the very comprehensive, very nice documentation about all the React query hooks. I have a link somewhere, and definitely in my repository. So it has samples for everything, including that modern fancy GraphQL thing and React Native. Okay, let's get back. So we already talked about the basic use cases, how to load the data, how to use get, the caching, some kind of configuration capabilities. So let's proceed with the second part, which is how we modify the data. from the terms of HTTP, APIs, and this kind of stuff, all the data modifications is post, patch, or put endpoints calls. Yeah. So in the same way, if you want to do that, it's better to define a separate function which will call axios.patch or fetch with a patch verb, so whatever. And React queries provides the separate hook called Usehouses, which is used when you need to modify something by some kind of user interaction or coding interaction, depending on the business logic. And this thing functions slightly different because it should not run every time. So basically, from the coding perspective, it looks similar. So you define your own hook. For example, for me, it is use patch character, which is simply calls use mutation hook from the React query. And the only thing we need to define is what to call when mutation is triggered. So the only argument here is another function. It is like the error function, and we anticipate that we receive some kind of payload, and after that we will call our patch one function, which do access.patch. And also we can use optional arguments. So we can define what to do on success, for example, to call the console log or have the small pop-up with, yay, we did successful mutation. Or what to do on errors. Again, you have to track the errors somehow. And there are some other things similar to the previous hooks. What is different is when you use it inside component like this, use patch character would return you the object with set of properties, which will have just a mutate function. And there is one more called mutate async, but it's not interesting right now. So it would just return you the tool to use and would not work immediately. So which is kind of what is expected. And then, for example, when the button is clicked or when something has happened, you just call in this mutate function and provide the data, which will be used by Axios call later. So like we're working in UI, button clicked, and we call that mutate. Looks pretty simple. Let's get back to the code and check how it looks like in the WebStorm. Here is our usage of use patch character. And if you go inside, it is pretty much what I mentioned in the sampling slides. So we have use mutation from the React query, and we provide there the query function, which is arrow function, calling the Axios thing. And on success, we have the character patched. And one more interesting thing to refresh the cache. There are nice capabilities to work with the caching. And really, when we change some object, we will need to update the cache so that all other hooks, all other components which uses this data would be rendered once again and refresh the UI components. So that's why here we might want just to call the query client, and there is a function invalidate queries, where you provide in the cache key in the same form as you used in the use query, like this. Yeah. And the cleaning of that cache would force the this use query hook to be triggered once again and to load the data proactively for you. Let's take a look. I really need to do it slightly differently, but okay. So let's refresh the page once again, and there is imitate patch character button, yeah, which actually called the mutate. It would fail because there is no patch endpoint in this API. But this is also interesting because we will test by that how the error catching would work. Yeah, so I'm clicking that, and I literally see that, okay, there is the error from the local host from the network, like something went wrong, no matter what. And then we have Axios error written into console log here. And we can see what is that error network, everything, what was. And we can literally see that we have this error in our code, in character.query.ts. So this is very useful if we want to have the generic error handling. For example, we can define our own usage of use query hook, like use base query, for example, and define the generic error handling, and then just reuse it in all the other places. And again, we can clear all the console log and click these couple of buttons like invalidate houses, which would call the query client in invalidate, and we'll see that the data for the houses would be loaded once again, which is pretty convenient. Let me take a look here. So there is invalidate houses, which is attached to the button. And when we call it, we just call query client, invalidate queries, and we use the IDs for the houses data. It's very useful when we need to update something, not just based on the hook mutation result, but based on whatever logic we have. And that's why it's very important to have all the keys stored in some functions or constants so that we can reuse it outside of the query definition.
So house query IDs is a constant that specify for caching, or is it?
It is a function
Yeah.
which is specified for caching, and it is defined in the same file where the query is, but it can be used outside. Once again, if you just read the documentation of the React query, they will tell you, okay, you can use like this. You can just define the query key as whatever you want, or maybe even as a simple string. But if you think at least as one step forward, you will understand, okay, if I have the cache and the keys, I will need to work with it, to have an interaction with it somehow. So in our company, we decided that we will extract all of those things into the separate constants or functions, depending on what is that. And that would give you capability to reuse it and maybe even to test it more carefully.
I'm trying to process this pattern in a head. So okay, you specified the function, and then in the other place where you invalidated cache, you already used basically this argument with the use houses. So use houses is something like additional. You specified it like that.
Let's name it here. Let's name it here like this, and this would be much easier. So like this, use houses key.
Yeah.
That would be much more readable, I think.
And no, I was just looking at the code, to familiarize a bit, but it's clear.
So
thank you.
It's just keys. It's just set of keys to have some kind of structure for the caching. And if you go inside, there is a ton of things how to work with QueryClient. I didn't put any of those except of invalidate queries here because I didn't use most of those, but you see it's a lot of stuff. So you can have, for example, you have plenty of capabilities. If you want to just use a hook, you can use the things like is loading or is success based on the hook return value. But if you have a lot of hooks, for example, and you need to have some kind of generic dashboard with data loading statuses, I don't know, I'm a little bit speculating right now, but if you need to make the very comprehensive solution, you can just use the query client, and you can have all that things like get query data or is fetching based on the key, and you can get all the statuses. You can use set queries data if you don't need to reload. Yeah, for example, if you just did use mutation and you already have the result and you know it is successful, you don't need to load it once again over HTTP. You can just put the result of the data into cache, and that would be more efficient based on your logic. Yeah, you can. I don't know the difference between invalidate queries or refetch queries. According to my experience, they do the same. And it's really a lot of stuff here. And the more important thing, clear. Yeah. So, for example, you can use this one to clear the cache before the browser closes the tab, for example, for security reasons. Now I I'm asking myself where this data is stored, and it might be not just memory. It might be, for example, some local storage, but I'm not sure. It's a thing to check later. Probably it's more just an application.
You mean the data about cached queries, that kind of
Yeah,
data?
yeah, yeah.
Yeah, it sounds like a memory. It should be memory, in my
Should be
opinion, but let's
memory,
see.
yes.
Yeah.
Should be memory. But again, if now it is a place with more capabilities. If you want to implement some kind of extension of that, you can have own query client provider, which does the same, like the same set of functions, or maybe subset of those, but store the data differently. And it's again just because everything is wrapped with a query client provider. And you can have own query client if you want. So it's nice capabilities here. But again, let's take a look what we have left in the presentation. So we just talked about the cache management thing. So once again, we can use the query client everywhere to invalidate queries or fetch queries or do whatever we want based on the caching key. And the same for error handling. Also, the next very important question, and the first problem which I had with React Query Hooks was, okay, what if I don't know how many calls I need to do? What if it should be an array of different API calls depending on my inputs? For example, there is a functionality in our application where we have some basic data and some options. And when you click on the options, there is the details loaded. And based on the option type, it can be several hooks. Yeah, and implementation of that would be super complicated, maybe even impossible without one more thing, which called useQueries. And it behaves in the same way like useQuery, but it takes the list of parameters and it basically anticipate the calling one get function multiple times with different parameters. And of course, it can be the big list, and your API might not handle all of those at the same time as we have such issue. So my sample already has the p-limit implementation sample, so that we have some kind of rate limiting thing if you want to have some limitations. So once again, the use case is when you don't know amount of API calls. So it is dependent on something, but the calls are similar. So it calls to the same URL mostly, but with different parameters. You can use queries function, which takes array of those parameters, and it would return the array of query results. So basically, it's a wrapper around the use query, but it is possible to use it in React component. Otherwise, you cannot put the hook definition inside the for loop or mapping or everywhere. React won't work with that. To make it work, you might need to use this array thing. I don't have example for that in a WebStorm right now, just here, but it is a thing to think about if you need to have some kind of customization. And we are getting close to the end. Here is the link and the screenshot for the documentation. Once again, it is extremely awesome. That documentation is maybe one of the best which I've read, actually. It has less words, more samples, very practical things. And if you want to get really deep, you just look into the code. It is TypeScript, so you can really take a look. You can go to definition and see all the comments on how it works. I think we can sum up and maybe then get back to the code to discuss any other potential questions. Okay?
Yeah.
So we discussed lots about React Query Hooks and how it can work. So my main output was that it is less code for the basic scenarios, for the basic use cases. So if you just want to have the data loading, but you want to track errors, you want to track the status, this library serves very good for that. It includes the caching data capabilities and caching manipulation thing, also quite useful. The tracking thing, as I mentioned, the transformation is also pretty straightforward thing here. So you don't need to have the separate thing. So it's already something which developers, the founders of those libraries thought about in advance for you. And of course, it has the mutation and all the other things. What is the drawbacks? Because of course there are some. Of course, it's not for the classical client state management. So if you want to have like several dependent on each other React components, and it is just some kind of local client state, maybe you can do it with React query hooks, but that would not look nice. So you will implement a lot for the simple thing. So for such scenarios, it's better to use something traditional like Redux or Mobix or something else. And it is not for the comprehensive dependent data loading when you have only a couple of endpoints depending on each other. It is still okay. But if you will have, I don't know, 5 or 6 of those, the code of React component would be just a mess. And you will need to think very hard to wrap it out into something else so that it's working. And we did that. So we have the couple of places when we have 3 or 4 calls dependent on each other. They all were wrapped in the one big use some kind of details data hook. And it returned, so it needed to track the statuses of all dependent hooks in one and return is success based on 4 different is successes, for example. So it doesn't look good. So in this case, you might need to think about some custom solution. And of course, yeah, if you really don't know what kind of data you load in and you will know it only in the runtime, for example, most probably you will need to have the custom solution because otherwise you might not even have a possibility to do that just because of the nature of those hooks. Here's the link to the sample repository. It has the README with all that stuff. And I think we're done with the main thing. So we can proceed with the questions and any kind of other discussions.
Awesome. I just have a few. But first of all, huge compliments. Very structured, very clear material. I think it's really great, especially for people like me. I didn't touch React in like, hard to say how many years. That's but really thanks for the presentation. It was great. First question I have. So you described this basic scenario in which it's used. Basic scenarios in which it's useful to use this kind of library. I'm wondering, in your experience, how often would you like to actually control all the requests to a server in that kind of way? In which sort of applications, in how many applications? It's a broad question.
I guess in most of cases, because HTTP, especially with nowadays internet, it's pretty fast, but it's not lightning fast, so it's not immediate. And when the page is loading, the call that XML HTTP request is handled and created, so the code would need to wait a little bit, and you will need to show something, some kind of placeholder data, some is loading indication, something like that, and then you will need to exchange it. And I don't know a lot of applications which doesn't have server data. Now you need to store something somewhere. So I guess it's most of those.
Definitely. Using server data is kind of must, I guess. But my question was when you need this layer to control all kind of requests, when you make a decision to bring this functionality into your app, or it's for you is if you do in a XHR request, then you should already be thinking of that.
Mostly yes, but okay, let's put it like that. If you're writing some pretty simple thing with not a lot of components and not a lot of with a small data layer, for example, even in the client side, you can just have the direct calls and just have the default placeholder. and don't handle all of that. But since you have the production working application, and since you need to track all the errors, and you have hundreds of different calls, and you really want to track all of those in the same way, and you want to bring other developers quite fast, so that even if they don't know these functionalities, they can jump in and fix something or add something. Since that moment, it is very important to have the similar homogeneous coding practices. And this way gives you that. So it feels like a framework. Since even if it is highly customizable, it feels like a framework. So you have certain limitations, but they are not restricting you. In fact, they are more like aligning the code into some shape.
Yeah. Yeah, thanks. Yeah, then next is not really a question, but like my perception of this what you described, this functionality. I'm wondering if you agree or not, and maybe you have something
Okay.
to add. So I think it looks to me like as you would use a GraphQL Apollo client, but more for REST applications, so for RESTful applications sort of thing.
Maybe I don't have exact answer to that because I have not used that.
Okay. Yeah,
Yeah,
that's fair.
my
Yeah.
coding experience led me in such paths that I never touched GraphQL. I don't know how, but it's really it's weird situation. But a lot of people talk about that, and I never tried it. So maybe I should just do a pet project.
And another part of this perception of mine is that it still feels like I left React quite some time ago, and it still feels like you when you need to make your application, you also have to bring all kind of libraries and to manage it yourself. So that's not a framework
Totally
like
true.
feeling.
Totally
Okay.
true.
Okay.
Even the base page of their documentation still states we're not a framework. We are a library to do this. And if you want to have the state management, okay, go to Redux. If you want to have this, go there, and so on and so forth. So it is they still following their initial beliefs in that. And that's not a bad thing, I think, because there should be at least one library, at least one provider which does that, because not everybody want to bring and get a huge knowledge of Angular, for example, for the small thing, especially because the Angular would change every maybe even half of the year very drastically, and you will need to keep yourself up to date with that, which is okay, by the way, but it requires some mindset for that. But React remained mainly the same ideas since the very beginning. Shape was different, but the ideas mainly the same.
Okay. Yeah, checked. Then, so we discussed Redux as a state manager. So React Query is not exactly the same. So I'm wondering, what is an exact alternative for React Query, if there is one?
That's a good question. I was thinking about that, and I don't know right now the correct answer, like what would be the exact competitor for the React Query hooks. Probably there is some, because right now we have lots of so-called mini frameworks. Yeah, so most probably there would be some mini state management thing. If I was in a position to implement something similar, but not Redux and not React Query hooks, I would definitely try something with MobX. They're still alive, and the only the only restriction, you need to convince your team to use the Typescript and to use the decorators, because they are heavily based on that. So if you don't have problems with that, MobX would be pretty nice, because amount of boilerplate is much less than in React, but still you will need to implement the store thing by yourself and maybe some server layers, and come up with some kind of guidelines how your architecture looks like. So because it's not out of the box, it's something you need to create. But still, that would be I would think the MobX would sit somewhere in between, because it also uses observable pattern, which is partially related to what's inside the query hooks, but it is not so heavy as Redux implementation, so you don't need to implement all of those things by yourself.
All right, all right. Yeah. Again, thanks. I have last one, and I have yeah, it's actually not. It's related to what we discussed. You were touching it a bit, like you said under the hood. I don't know exactly what is using. Maybe it's using use state, for example, to keep the caches or something like that. It was context, and my question was like regarding the states. Let's say if indeed it uses use state, the React Query hooks library, then my question was, okay, but if my application uses React Query and if for some reason it uses use state, will this state be like a singleton for the whole application? Is it possible that it will actually collide with other parts of application that trying to save something in this state?
Yeah, I get the question. No, it's different a little bit. So when you define, when you use hook use state in the React component or in other hooks, it's basically just a memory state, and it is tightly related to the place where it is defined. So they are not overlapping with each other. And this is a mechanism to manipulate the behavior of the component or behavior of the hook. So sometimes that those use states are used not to store the data, but just to trigger the updates, trigger the rendering functions in certain moment. And if I was, for example, designing this kind of mini library like use query, right now I would use state to have that flags like is loading, is error, those kind of stuff, or at least the simple status strings there, and just update it based on the execution of some functions like data loading is completed. And by the way, I opened the implementation of React query use-based query thing. So they have the same query client inside, and some kind of observers pattern definitely there. Yeah, here it is, React use state. Okay. So my what's the word in English? So my guess was kind of correct. Maybe not exactly, but it was kind of correct. So they use state, and the use callbacks on something changed. So yeah.
Well, that's all I have. Yeah, huge thanks a lot again. Super nice presentation, very clear, structured, and yeah, I got a really a new. Yeah, I got to know a lot of new stuff myself today.
Okay, thank you so much for the invitation. That was a nice Saturday morning, and I really wanted to share this thing because from the recent several months, working with this library was one of the probably best things I've done in a couple of years, maybe. So it was really inspiring. So thanks for the possibility to share this information.
All right. Thanks, and yeah, see you next time. See you next. Yeah, I hope this year still, but that's gonna be defined in very soon. So yeah, wish you all the great weekend and then great holidays as well.
Yeah, have a great holiday.